Yeah, I want to read something from your article.
Sure.
Okay, that's directly relevant to that. It's from a section called "It Was Like a Dam Burst." And so this is right after October 7th. And these are comments by Robert Krell, who's the former director of postgraduate education in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of British Columbia. The impression that the violence unfolding around them is somehow invisible to the state responsible for their protection has overwhelmed not only relative newcomers to Canada like Rugheimer, man you discussed, but also Jews who have lived in Canada for decades. Then you refer to Robert Krell. And the next section is, almost none of these verbal or physical assaults, okay, so we're talking about repeated demonstrations, for example, all across the country, long-term occupations of university campuses, most particularly at McGill and at the University of Toronto, with like sporadic outbursts at Concordia, which is its own kind of rat hole, and then in a variety of other places across Canada, right? Riots in Montreal as well, downtown demonstrations in Toronto. Almost none of these verbal or physical assaults are coming from white supremacists, very rare breed in Canada, or anti-Semites of the right-wing variety. Now, those people exist, eh? I mean, when I joined forces with the Daily Wire, one of whose lead spokespeople, let's say, is Ben Shapiro, who's probably the most well-known Orthodox Jew, American Orthodox Jew in the world, the right-wing anti-Semites came after me in droves, and they had been doing that for years for a variety of reasons. So those people exist, and they're entirely detestable in 15 different dimensions, but they're not organized in the same manner as these left-wing anti-Semites, and they don't pose anywhere near the danger. And, well, this is what you describe in your article. They are being carried out by self-described progressives, Arabs, and often recent immigrants who are operating inside an ideological framework of settler colonialism, which casts Canada, the US, Australia, and most of all Israel as irredeemably illegitimate constructs of imperialism, capitalism, genocide, and racism. It's an ideology that has found a comfortable home in Trudeau's Canada. Okay, so let's zero in on this a little bit. So
Sure.
I wrote an article about Jewish support for the Democrats about 3 months ago for a UK publication. It was, I tried to publish it at the National Post and at the Telegraph, and they'll usually pretty much take whatever I send them, but they found this one too contentious. And
that's odd.
Yeah, you saw it.
No, I say that's odd.
Well,
where did it appear finally?
It appeared in, let's see. I can't,
okay.
It escapes me momentarily.
After you should send it to me.
I'll send it to you. But let me just tell you, it's just because in the U.S., the support among Jews for the Democrats is very high. It historically runs 75 to 80%. Now, you draw some relationships in your article, which I think are very much worth drawing, because I don't know, maybe this took the Jewish liberal community by surprise. But it's completely unsurprising if you understand the progressive ideological agenda that the Palestinians were cast as victims. And if people are going to play out a victim-victimizer narrative, which is a progressive narrative, the Jews are always going to be cast as victimizers because they are overrepresented in positions of authority and preeminence, radically so. And now my interpretation of that is that the competent rise to the top, and there's a variety of reasons for excessive Jewish competence, and it's marked, for example, in the fact that the Jews have produced an overwhelmingly disproportionate number, let's say, of Nobel laureates, right? And so it's a culture that places tremendous emphasis on intellectual ability, and there's more to it than that. But the alternative hypothesis is that it's a cabal, and it's a cabal that dominates, and it's a worldwide cabal. And if you buy the victim narrative, which is key to the progressive agenda, then the Jews are going to be at the top of the list.
The whole diversity, equity, and inclusion phenomenon, there's absolutely no room for the Jews there. It's impossible to
Well, if the rule is, if your ethnic group is overrepresented statistically, you're a oppressor, then that puts the Jews at the top of the oppressor hierarchy. Okay, so now one of the things I'm curious about, and I'd like your thoughts about this, is that I don't exactly understand why the Jewish community didn't see this coming. Because this is a logical consequence
of that. What do you mean,
that.
American Jews? Well, I'm going to talk about Canadian Jews. Things are a little weird in the United States. And I mean, I think I can understand a lot of the intellectual community, the strata in the United States, finding Donald Trump vulgar and repugnant. And that's why a lot of Jews, I think, didn't vote for him.
Yeah, well, I think
Different
that's
than
true
Israelis,
for many people. Well, they didn't vote for Trump. But it's such that
The Israelis, interestingly, supported Trump more than a Kamala Harris presidency. Mm-hmm. They kind of went, oh, yeah, well,
the
don't like to admit it, but I hope
Well,
Trump
the Democrats
was.
didn't exactly cover themselves in glory with regards
so.
to their support for Israel
Quite
after
so.
October 7th.
Quite so.
So, I think the Israelis understand more clearly because of necessity which side their bread is buttered on, let's say.
Yeah.
But this really it's really a pernicious twist, right? Because I do see the victim narrative driving this radical increase in left-wing anti-Semitism. And I don't see any way.
That's one way of understanding it.
Yeah.
I think other people have used the term cultural Marxism, which kind of, it certainly borrows the language of Marxism and borrows the language of the left, but of course replaces the proletariat, the working class, is replaced by this kind of, rainbow coalition.
Yeah, various dimensions
ethnic,
of oppression.
racial, and gender subsets and subgroups.
Yes, I think
So
those are
But the
parallel
other thing I think that's
explanations.
important to understand about anti-Semitism, it's not just like any other prejudice. It's not just another bigotry. It's a conspiracy theory. Mm-hmm. It's always been a conspiracy theory. And I think a lot of people who perhaps were once Marxists or are informed by the intellectual tradition in Marxism can easily get that wrong, can easily imagine that, the powerful hand of the international bourgeoisie has, their names often end in Stein and Berg. Mm-hmm. And the next thing it's the Jews are being thrown down wells. And I think just to understand where we are in Canada particularly, I think it's really necessary to understand the trajectory of the left over the last 25, 30 years.
Yes,
go back a
and
little
also
further.
the fact that when you describe the trajectory of the left, you're also now describing the trajectory of the federal liberals, which wouldn't have necessarily been the for the last 10 years.
Well, here's how it goes.
Okay, lay it out.
With the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? Much of the democratic left was perfectly content with this, was very happy about this.
With the collapse.
Yes.
Yes.
Much of the democratic left was, or at least resigned to it and confused by it. And then during the 1990s, the primary iteration of left-wing activism in politics was anti-globalization, showing up at these massive demonstrations at the IMF and the World Bank and the World Economic Forum. And then came 9/11. And 9/11 was kind of like a blunt trauma wound to everybody's head. Everybody went a little bit weird. It was such a shock. I mean, it was like out of a movie, some kind of a science fiction movie. And immediately, what happened was, the left's, the iteration of the international left and the activist milieu was cloaked in anti-war activism, right? And it shouldn't have taken much effort on the part of the mass media. Unfortunately, I have to confess as a lifelong journalist, the media was not at all helpful in failing to recognize that this phenomenon that was being presented on the nightly news and on the front pages of the paper as an anti-war movement, they were actually on the other side. They weren't against war. They were on the other side. And at the core of it, at the very, very core of it, whatever you happen to think about Afghanistan or Iraq, at the core of it was anti-Zionism, this thing called anti-Zionism. And that had sort of percolated from the 1970s. A lot of it was informed by Soviet propaganda, but from the United Nations, the Durban Conference, the proposition that Zionism is racism, right? Mm-hmm. Now, in Canada, the way Erwin Kotler put it to me, I think very well, he's kind of my lodestar, I confess.
Tell everybody who he is.
Well, he's a former Canadian Justice Minister. He founded the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, and I'm a senior fellow with the Raoul Wallenberg Center. And he's beloved of persecuted Democrats the world around, whether it's Hong Kong or Belarus or just about anywhere, Russia. Anyway, the way he put it to me was that in Canada, particularly, Canadians are the United Nations is kind of in our DNA.
Right.
You know, the way we understand our role in the world, our place in the world. I mean, we were there at the foundation of Israel. We were there in the crafting of the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. We were there in all of the protocols and conventions that arose from the ashes of the Shoah. This was a very Canadian thing, and it was something to be proud of. But what we haven't really noticed over the years is the way the United Nations has been taken over by the Organization of the Islamic Congress. It's been taken over by the police state bloc. The last time I looked, I think Beijing was basically in control of 7 of the 11 major United Nations agencies. Mm-hmm. And then you get the United Nations Relief Works Agency, which is this strange organization that keeps alive the prospect that Israel is just a temporary aberration, and that one of the, somehow the massively growing Palestinian refugee population, it's not really a refugee population, will somehow be sorted by the restoration of a Palestinian or an Arab sovereignty in all the places where Israel currently exists. So it's really hard for Canadians to sort of think, maybe the United Nations, are we the baddies,
And so how do you see that in parallel with the politicization of like the pro-Hamas movements in Canada? And there's things running in parallel here. We talked about the victim-victimizer narrative. We talked about the alliance between the progressive left and the claim that Zionism is part of the colonial movement, which includes Canada and the U.S. Now you've introduced Canada's role in the UN and our historical allegiance with the UN. How do you see those tangling together?
The way I see those tangling together, if we can think of it in terms of the Liberal Party or the Trudeau Liberals, right? Not the same as what a lot of people imagine the Liberals to be, is that this kind of intellectual slovenliness, that the sort of blind adherence to United Nations declarations and so on,